After the Titan implosion Coast Guard hearings, and after both the Discovery and Netflix documentaries, I noticed that people are still posting questions about the dive history related to the two versions of the hulls. The two documentaries did a poor job of explaining the history of OceanGate, the hulls, and the dive numbers. Here I am showing the original Coast Guard graphic that was used in their presentation at the start of the hearings. It was only used briefly during the hearings. This is a very powerful overview. It hasn't been reproduced much, but I have used it a lot in my videos where I used it with many modifications. I imagine it's not discussed a lot because it was only used in the introductory Coast Guard presentation at the start of the hearings and only presented as a single overview slide. I took this graphic and improved it. I reworked the spacing of the bars to better align with the dive numbers, which improves the ability to bracket the expedition time frames, and I tweaked the contrast and the color. Then I used it a lot in my videos. It was very helpful to tell the stories. I labeled it in many different ways. So I understand why there still is some confusion about dives because this Coast Guard graphic is only about the version 2 hull, and the dive logs are a bit hard to follow. I realize that not many people have researched the Coast Guard hearings in the Marine Board of Investigation documentation as much as I have. And the Discovery and Netflix documentaries, although well-produced and interesting, did not have enough time to clarify dive histories or explain much engineering. Let's start with a blank graph based on the original Coast Guard graph, but cleaned up with no additional labels. This original graph shows all the dives of the version 2 hull. It starts with water testing of the version 2 hull in the Everett Marina with dive 50 on April 29, 2021, and ends with the implosion dive, dive 88, on June 18, 2023. I used this Coast Guard format, which they did in Excel, and applied it to the dives of the version 1 hull so you could see the dive history in a similar way. And it allows me to clarify the dive history and interject some clarifying stories. We will break this chart down more, but this is a good time to mention that OceanGate numbered all of their dives in sequence from dive 1, which occurred on 2/6/18, across both hulls to dive 88. It did not matter how shallow the dive was, it got numbered. So this chart starts with dive 1 on 2/6/18 and ends with dive 49 on 8/7/19. They did do an unusual thing one time. In the Bahamas, they did dive 45 on 3/20/19 and then labeled the next dive 45.1 on 4/12/19 before continuing again with dive 46 on 4/14/19. So all of you remember the Spencer composite carbon fiber winding video, and all of you remember the video of gluing the titanium ring to the hull, which occurred in July of 2017. Then there is this time lapse that most of you have seen of building the first Titan. This is the one that would do dive 1 in Everett Marina.
We're going to go to 4,000 meters after our testing in the Bahamas, assuming all things pan out as we expect and we validate our engineering. With this, ID christen Titan.
So let's break down the earliest V1 hull chart. This is just after the version 1 of Titan was built in Everett, Washington and christened. They did 18 early test dives in Everett before moving the testing to the Bahamas. This chart is the early test dives. The deepest dive was to 37 meters in Everett Bay. The entries into the dive log list the testing as submerges on the Lars and working to figure out ballast weight and buoyancy. After this, the Titan was loaded on a trailer to begin the shipping process to get to the Bahamas. You can imagine how difficult the logistics are. I'm not sure what date they managed to get to the Bahamas and get everything assembled with the Titan on the Lars, but the entry in the dive logs has the lightning damage on 4/28/18, so this occurred before they even managed a numbered dive. They would begin testing in Marsh Harbor in the Bahamas, starting with dive 19 on 5/8/18, and finish in the Bahamas with dive 48 on 4/18/19. So let's break down the testing in the Bahamas. Things get interesting quickly in the Bahamas. Look at this dive log entry for dive 21 where it states sub in stripped configuration for unmanned tests. Then this entry for dive 22, where they write about adding syntactic foam to the aft. This would have been to adjust the center of gravity and get the sub to float level. And also from dive 22, they write, sub manageable with multiple divers. This means that the 23,000-pound sub has its buoyancy calculated well enough that while it is hanging on a string, multiple divers can shift it around in the water. That is quite an achievement that does not get discussed. They were prepping for 3 unmanned dives, which would go progressively deeper on a line. These would be dives 24, 25, and 26. These were the dives before Stockton took his much-discussed unmanned dive, where the hull was making all the popping and cracking sounds. The unmanned dives got to 1,200, 2,500, and 4,000 meters. Regarding the popping and cracking sounds, OceanGate recorded acoustic emission data on the unmanned dives and saw AE spikes, so they knew popping was happening. But just looking at the plots of the AE spikes from the unmanned dives did not fully prepare Stockton for how loud they actually sounded when he was inside the hull for dives 38 and 39. That is why, although he expected sounds, he was surprised by the volume. One of the things that annoyed me about the Discovery and Netflix films is they both used video footage of these test dives, but never explained what was going on or how significant it was from an engineering perspective to do these 3 unmanned test dives on a string. Tony discussed this briefly during his testimony.
I dropped it on a fishing line, 200-pound strength deep sea fishing line, because I could calculate the buoyancy. I was 150 pounds negative, and we started with that.
Out here, we're really focused on one thing, and that's the pressure vessel, and making sure that that component, which is clearly the most critical component of the sub, is safe and capable of handling depths down to 4,000 meters repeatedly with people on board.
What's worse is the Netflix film ignores discussing the test dives and cuts to a team meeting discussing dive 39, which is Stockton's manned dive, and they start the segment with the title, Titan's First Deep Ocean Test.
So we've got dive 39, objective of a 4,200 meter depth.
This introductory line is not only incorrect, but they also ignore dive 38, which had an interesting engineering detail. It was supposed to be Stockton's deep dive, but they did not load enough weight, so the sub stopped sinking. The dive log notes this. So they recalculated the necessary weight and 3 days later did dive 39, which gets all of the attention because Stockton got down to Titanic depth, and the films loved the drama of showing Stockton during the dive with all the popping and cracking sounds. Of course, this is meaningless because this is occurring in the V1 hull, which has nothing in common with the V2 hull. Neither of the films discussed the fact that a couple of these early test dives were the dives that Tony Nissen measured the inward creep of the acrylic viewport and found that it was meeting his predicted design parameters. You can get a glimpse of his test rig in some of the Netflix film.
I told Stockton, like, we need to test that viewport, so we had no data on that. So the first deep test we did when I hung it on a fishing line, we instrumented it to measure its displacement. That was really, really important. And the displacement came back dead nuts on for everything that we're looking at.
So when the films are planned around everything that's negative and to make Stockton look bad, all of these interesting and relevant engineering stories are left out. The next set of dives in the Bahamas was done for more testing, and a lot had to do with figuring out ballast weight. There was another significant dive to 991 meters. That leads us to another famous dive of the V1 hull, Dive 47, the dive with Carl Stanley. This is the first dive of the V1 hull with Stockton and passengers aboard. It is so interesting to hear Carl tell the story of this dive in his numerous interviews after the implosion. He did a great job discussing it in the Discovery film, and he was very compelling during the hearings.
But you could actually drive to deeper water by the cracking sounds would amplify when you got deeper. Kind of like a grand finale of cracking sounds as we were getting close to the surface. That material degraded so much that it stored energy that was then released as the pressure was released. Indulge me a few minutes to lay out what I think about this, seeing that OceanGate came very, very close to killing me.
This is a good time to review a few things. Remember, the lightning event was when they first arrived in the Bahamas, so all dives were done after it. Despite that, the hull survived 3 dives to greater than 3,700 meters. Tony testified about the lightning strike.
At that time, did you believe that the lightning strike affected the actual carbon fiber hull?
Yeah, I told Stockton and said that there's probably a good chance that that hull's compromised.
And what did he say?
It'll be okay.
Finally, the day after the Stanley dive is the last logged dive in the Bahamas, which is Dive 48 on 4/18/19. This may have been the day that the crack was identified. It's not clear, but here's the story told by Tony.
I got a picture. I said, I think the email was, "Hey, Tony, is this supposed to be there?" "Nope, that's a crack. Like, the hull's done." So I left my desk and I went to Bob Schumann and I said, "Titan's got a crack in it." I said, "The hull's done." And we started carving it out and noticed that the crack was bigger than we thought.
So instead of mobilizing to Newfoundland, Titan went back to Everett. The dive logs show one more shallow dive there, and then OceanGate did something odd. During the building of the hull, Stockton did not want to take the time or spend the money to test the hull in the Deep Ocean Test Facility. But after the crack, they sent it there on October 17th, 2019 to test it and then derate its depth capability. So this is the end of the V1 hull. They scrapped it. Stockton then used electro-impact to build the V2 hull with the co-bonded technique. And after putting Titan back together again with a new viewport from Heinz Fritz, they tested the hull at the Deep Ocean Test Facility, where they completed 5 high-pressure cycles. After these chamber tests is when the next set of dive bar graphs start, back in Everett with Dive 50. In Washington, Titan does 11 test dives, with the deepest being 170 meters, and then it is transported to St. John's to start the first season of dives over the Titanic with Dive 61. Dive 61 is interesting because this is where they are learning how to drag the Lars up and down the ramp on the back of the Horizon Arctic. Fred Hagen is on Dive 61. Because they only put 4 bolts in the dome and the return of the Lars onto the ship was too rough, the dome fell off onto the deck of the Lars. They repaired and replaced it and did Dive 62, also with Fred Hagen on board, but only got to 1,700 meters because of an issue with the thrusters. This is where I need to interject the business model problem. Fred Hagen would return to successfully get to the Titanic during the next season on Dive 80, but this trip would have been a free return attempt. So this is a seat that is not generating new income during the second season. The OceanGate dive logs have Dive 63 as the first dive to make it successfully to the Titanic wreck site. The next interesting dive I would like to discuss is Dive 66. This dive got to the Titanic debris field, but never found the main section of the wreck. A mission specialist on this dive shared the tracking map with me. This is the OceanGate tracking map of Dive 66, and you can see how the Titan missed the stern and the bow to the east. This is a good time to ask if you are enjoying this content and that in the other Titan videos I've made. If so, watch to the end, and I will discuss my comprehensive Titan book. Now let's skip ahead to the second season and a controversial dive, Dive 80. This is the dive where a loud bang was heard just after resurfacing. Stockton blamed it on the hole shifting in the frame, but the strain data showed that the hole was damaged. The shift in strain coincided with a loud acoustic emission spike, and the hull showed altered strain behavior in subsequent dives. Renata Rojas, who helped on many of the missions, finally got to dive to the Titanic on Dive 81. And amazingly, after the damage that the hull seemed to sustain at Dive 80, the hull made 3 more deep dives, 2 of which made it to Titanic depth. But then a major issue occurred. A business decision was made to leave the Titan in St. John's, not inspect the hull, but worse, store it outside in freezing weather for most of the winter. This is a huge issue if there was any water intrusion into the hull or the clevis and tang joint. The third season of dives starts with horrible weather over the Titanic, so for the first 4 missions of the season, no Titanic attempts were made. A consolation dive was attempted but aborted at the continental shelf. This was Dive 86, which had the YouTuber Jake Kohler on board. The next dive, Dive 87, another attempt at the continental shelf, was aborted, and when resurfacing the Lars, there was a huge problem that caused the rear of the Titan to stay pointed downward, while the front of the Titan was pointed upwards. The wave action on the Lars caused the Titan to slam against the Lars forcefully for about 45 minutes. The Kroiman couple was on this dive.
So the phone is the Titan. We were like this. And then anytime we'd hit a wave, the 2 pins, it would lift and then it would slam back down. Lift and slam, lift and slam, lift and slam. Dan and I were seated in the dome. So every lift, it was bone jarring.
After Dive 87, the Titan, towed behind the Polar Prince, went back to port for a night. Then the weather over the Titanic site cleared, so they steamed back out to sea, positioned over the Titanic, and proceeded to do Dive 88, which reached about 3,346 meters and then imploded. That was the tragic end to the OceanGate story. So that is my attempt at presenting the chronological history of Titan dives using the bar graphs. I hope that helped you. Let me briefly explain my book. It is 300 color pages of details about the history of OceanGate, the Titan design and build, and failure. It is based on a careful analysis of all of the Coast Guard hearings and documents. It fills in everything that the Discovery and Netflix films left out. It's getting rave reviews. Visit www.titandives.com for more information. Thank you for your time and support.